We have a second person. Thank you.
Very good.
Fantastic. Good. Okay. So yes. Do you have any ideas what the rings represent?
I really don't.
Okay. Any thoughts? I'm just giving people on the chat time to
Thinking of many putting together. I don't.
It is partly that. It is partly the idea of unity. Yeah, absolutely right. So that's a start point. Any thoughts of colours? Oh, there's it. Oh, come on then. Yes.
I think they're continents.
Well, yes, it is unity, certainly. And so I think, you know, I'm not sure if it was necessarily just continents. It's just the concept of unity, but it's the colours, and that's why there are 5 of them rather than the continents. Any thoughts about why the colours? So I suppose it sort of links with continents, but it's actually the colour of the flags of the countries that were represented in, I think it was the 1912 Olympics. So it all comes from then. And do you know what the Olympic motto is? No reason why you should. Okay, well, this is what it is. Citius Altius Fortius. Oh, it's in Latin. How convenient. So faster, higher, stronger. We've got 3 comparative adverbs there. That's why we've got the IUS at the end. And that was the Olympic motto since 1894. But that has changed, and that has changed. And now it adds the communitaire, and that's since 2021. So it's the faster, higher, stronger together. Now, although these are Latin words, this is actually a school motto from an academy in Paris. And the reason that it was taken from that particular establishment is because of the person who established the modern Olympics. Do you know who that was? Absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. I was sort of thinking I'm going to try and make this more interactive than I might have done on my first one. It's going to come up shortly, and it might give people who are online either the chance to cheat and to Google it, or just to know the answer and pass it on to Tara. Okay, so we've talked about the rings, we've talked about the colours, we've talked about the motto, and we then have a torch relay. Any idea what that symbolises or what the purpose of that is? No.
Again, linking, I guess.
Well, it is partly to do with that. Now, the idea is that it's supposed to link to the origin. It's supposed to make it classical. But actually, there was no torch that was used at the origin of the ancient Olympic Games. But fire and flame is often used in is always used in ancient sacrifice if you're actually killing an animal. And so the idea was that the torch was to make a link back. But if you have a look at the torch that you've got as an image at the bottom of that screen, that's obviously very modern, isn't it? And you've got a torch there that's got surrounds to protect the flame, because the idea is that that flame is supposed to continue from when it's first lit, which is weeks before the beginning of the Olympic Games. And so you have those protections around it. But the idea was that it was to link to the idea in ancient times when you would have, as I say, you'd have feasting, you'd have sacrifices that all had something to do with fire. But the Olympic flame wasn't an ancient Olympic idea. It was actually 1928, so the Amsterdam Olympics. And in those Olympics, it was lit on top of a tower that overlooked the Olympic Stadium. And we'll have a look in a minute at one of the buildings that it now starts from, which is the Temple of Hera at Olympia. And that's the official start point of the modern Olympics, trying to make it an ancient ritual. So this is the guy that created the modern Olympics, and he is called Pierre de Coubertin. And that's why he used, although it's a Latin motto, it was a Latin motto for a Paris Academy. And he thought that was a rather good motto to use. And the modern Olympics were first hosted in Athens. As we know, right from the beginning, the venues change. There's a bidding process, as I think we're aware of now. Some countries actively not wanting to bid because of the cost of the Olympics, and some pulling out, and some countries feeling that actually it's a really good way of promoting themselves, their identity, and their role on the world stage. So it's every 4 years. We now have Winter Olympics as well as Summer Olympics. And actually it's only been cancelled twice, which I think is really impressive. First World War and the Second World War. Okay.
COVID delay.
Yes, true. Yeah, it was a delay though, not cancellation. Yeah, whereas those were cancelled. And again, what's different with the modern Olympics is the Paralympic Games, which have become very, very popular. And I sort of feel in a very nationalistic way, perhaps, that it was the 2012 Olympics that really pushed the Paralympics, I think. Do you know what began the Paralympics movement, where the Paralympics movement began? Okay, so Stoke Mandeville. So not very far from here. I know, yeah. Yeah. So again, I think the 2012 Olympics, we started to hear quite a lot about Stoke Mandeville. Now, I live in Buckinghamshire, I live in High Wycombe, and in fact, my daughter's a physiotherapist, and she has her job is around Bucks hospitals. And part of the reason that she wanted to have her first job in the area is partly because she could live at home and it's obviously a lot cheaper, but also because of the reputation of Stoke Mandeville. And we will ignore a rather unpleasant side of Stoke Mandeville's history, which is linked to Jimmy Savile. But apart from that, in terms of the spine unit and in terms of the work they've done, rehabilitation, it is a world expert there. And it was actually at Stoke Mandeville that the neurologist, the German neurologist, Ludwig Guttmann, was looking for a way to help his paraplegic patients. They were World War II victims. He wanted them to rehabilitate. Lots of them were, from the Air Force spinal cord units, which is injuries, which is a Stoke Mandeville speciality. And he then organised sporting events linked to the Olympic Games, which had taken place in London in 1948. And so that's when the Paralympic Games started out. And you had at the beginning a range of activities, some of which we're becoming quite used to today. We had a number that American returning soldiers were used to. So we'd got archery, netball, basketball, etc. And this then became a sporting movement rather than something that was purely just to encourage the rehabilitation. And I think this is just really quite a moving quote. Until then, the problem was hopeless because we had not only to save the life of these paraplegic or quadriplegic men, women and children, but also to give them back their dignity and to make them happy and respected citizens. And I think that's such a powerful quote. And this is something that I really felt the 2012 Olympics made a difference. I don't remember ever seeing anybody out running who had lost a limb, and people who were very happy to show that they had one limb, they had half a limb. And I think that the normality that was produced through the Paralympics in 2012 made a difference hugely in this country, but I also think in the Olympics since then. And as I say, that might be my British view of it, but I do think it made a big difference. And actually linked to that, and so we've got a little bit more information about the origin of the Paralympic Games. So we started off with 48. We then look at how it developed in 1952. Then the games were held every year. Obviously, we've got the Paralympic Games, which are very specific, linked to the Olympic Games, but initially then they developed on their own. And looking at the difference between the British involvement, first of all, and then loads more countries coming on board and as part of the physical therapy programs. And I don't know if you know anything about a program called The Last Leg. So it's a Channel 4 program. And again, this started out in the 2012 Olympics, and it was an 11 o'clock night, really sort of slightly risque program. And the idea originally was it just was going to take place during those Olympics, and it became such a cult program that it's often being used today. And I'm absolutely certain that it's going to be shown during the Paris Olympics. A number of people just, ask about these three presenters. So there are two presenters with disabilities. Josh Widdicombe, I'm fairly sure, was brought in as a known comedian who would give people a name that they could relate to and would introduce, that audience. And so since then, the three of them have been on that show, and it's become incredibly popular. But again, I just thought it was something for us to consider in terms of where that movement started and how mainstream the Paralympics and the programs and the discussion around disability has gone since then. So that takes me back now to the ancient Olympic Games. So just a little bit of information. So the first Olympic Games were held in 776 BCE. They were a pan-Hellenic, so all across Greece. And they were a festival that was not just athletic, but a religious festival. So predominantly in ancient times, any festival, whether it be a theatre festival or an athletic festival, was primarily a religious one. And the other bits were ways of worshipping, ways of showing off your prowess, but linked to the religious side of it. So, as they still are, every 4 years, they took place at Olympia. I will show you where Olympia is. But eventually they were banned by the Emperor Theodosius because they were seen as too pagan, basically. And so when we've got into Christianity, the practices that were linked to the ancient practices were not seen as appropriate anymore. And then we had this huge period of time when the Olympic Games went into abeyance until they were brought up much more recently. So we have quite a bit of evidence for the ancient Olympic Games. We have Pindar, who's a poet. So in some of the writing that has remained, we've got this quote: "Just as the sun shines brighter than any other star, so shines Olympia, putting all other games into the shade." And so that just reminds us that the Olympic Games weren't the only athletic games in ancient times. And so just having a look at this map of basically Europe and North Africa. So obviously we're talking about Greece as the origin. And then if we home into that, so we can see here the places where the various different games were. So the Pythian Games took place in Delphi, because that was the base for the god Apollo. You've got the Isthmian Games for the god Poseidon, god of the sea. You have the Nemean Games for Zeus, and because he's the king of the gods, so obviously we're going to have more than one type of contest for him. We then have the Olympic Games. So we can see Olympia there on the western side of Greece. And you can see just above it a city called Elis. And so Olympia was part of, in effect, it was within the sort of the county that Elis predominated and was in charge of. Okay, so the Olympic Games started off with something called a sacred truce. And the idea of the Olympic truce was to enable any of the athletes who are traveling throughout the Greek world to come safely to the Games. And although these were pan-Hellenic Games, Greece was not a country as a whole in those times. It was a whole series of separate city-states. And often there were wars between those separate city-states. So to enable all of those athletes to travel safely, that's why you had this sacred truce. And on the whole, this Olympic truce was faithfully observed, although we do know, and so the Thucydides, the historian, ancient historian, recounted that the Lacedaemonians were banned from participating in the Games after they attacked a fortress in Leprium, a town in Elis, as I say, the sort of the major town for Olympia during the truce. Now, they complained that the truce hadn't been announced, but the Eleans nonetheless fined them 2,000 minae, and that was 2 for each soldier, which is what the law required. Now, if we look at what this fine was, this isn't a pathetic little fine. So a mina was equivalent to 100 drachma. 1 drachma was an average worker's daily wage, or the price of a sheep. So the fine was a heavy one, equal to 200,000 drachmas. They took this seriously, and so countries tended to keep to that truce. And I think it's an important one for us to bear in mind, in that the unity that people around the world want to have at the Olympic Games, that's symbolized by those rings, was very much started with the ancient Olympic Games. And as I say, for most of the time when the ancient Olympic Games were on, there were wars going on between different city-states. So going back then to evidence for the Olympic Games. So we've got some writers. We've got Pindar, I spoke about earlier. He wrote victory odes or poems, and he was writing about the 5th century BCE. We have somebody called Pausanias who wrote, I love this, when I first heard about Pausanias, I thought, how can this exist in ancient times? He wrote a travel guidebook to Greece, and this included details of Olympia. So we talked about the Olympic site as part of that guidebook. We also have still remaining a range of artwork. So we've got, for example, statues, we've got some vase paintings. We'll see some of those, some of the clips that I show you. And we've also got archaeology of the site. So I'm going to show you some reconstructions of the site of Olympia, but also what still remains if you were to go to Olympia today. And I have to say, I'm going to put my hands up. I have not visited Olympia. It is somewhere that I have always wanted to go to, and I am hoping to be able to go there. I know, quite shocking really, that I haven't yet been to Olympia. Okay, so here we've got an artist's impression of Olympia. I think we can, see some fairly recognizable classical buildings here. We can see some temples here. You recognize this coming into this classroom. So we've got the colonnades here around the edge of the temple. You can see here that we've got a theatre. Remember not to confuse a theatre with an amphitheatre. Amphitheatres are double theatres. It's where we get the word amphi and ambi. So if a creature is ambidextrous, or if we are ambidextrous, then we can write or use both of our hands. An animal that is an amphibian can live in both water and land. So the amphi for the amphitheatre is both theatres back to back. So this is just a theatre that could be used both for theatrical performances, but also could be used in ancient times. They were known as Odeons, so not cinemas, but an Odeon was something that you saw. So you saw a performance, you heard people speaking. And then what we've got here is we've got an area for people to be congregating and practice areas there. And then here we have another reconstruction. Again, we can see the temples. We can see these covered walkways here. See this area for swimming in. And then having a look at the different buildings in the site. So the site contained a temple of Zeus. And as I said earlier, these Olympic Games were part of a religious festival which honoured Zeus. And so we've got an image of Zeus here, the thunderbolt. We can see here the eagle, the scepter here sitting on his throne. So you have symbols for the ancient gods that mean that you can see who each of them is. And here is what we have left today. So we can see some of the archaeological remains there. Now the statue of Zeus that we've got here inside the temple, and just a reminder that in ancient times, the temple was seen very much as the home of the god or the goddess. And the only people able to go into the temple would be the priest, so the religious people. Any sacrifices would take place outside the temple. So inside the temple would be, as I say, just for predominantly religious people. It would also be where people would provide any offerings to the god. Now, the statue of Zeus was over 13 meters tall, a huge statue. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was created by Phidias in 430 BC. Phidias was a very famous architect in Roman times, sculptor, who was involved in the building of the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. And Pausanias in his travel guide refers to this as the god is seated on his throne. He is made of ivory and gold. So think about how much that's going to have cost and how dramatic it would have looked. And on his head is a wreath representing sprays of olive. In his right hand stands a figure of victory, and his left hand is a scepter. The bird perched on the scepter is an eagle. The sandals of the god are golden, and so is his robe, which is decorated with animals and lilies. Okay. So there was an Olympic oath. So we've talked about the truce. We've started to get an idea of the site of Olympia. And once everybody had arrived at the site, both the competitors and the judges swore an oath to Zeus at the start of the games. And interestingly, they swore that they had trained for 10 months before. There's not allegiance necessarily to Zeus himself, but that they were prepared. Because the idea being that if you are prepared in your body, you're prepared in your mind. And the Greeks saw that correlation between the mind and the body, the beauty of the mind and the body working together. And therefore, you were showing your religious observance by doing the right physical practice, so that you're in the right physical and mental place for the games. The modern Olympic oath, however, this is slightly different. So, in the name of all competitors, I promise that we shall take part in these Olympic Games, respecting and abiding by the rules that govern them in the true spirit of sportsmanship, for the glory of sport and the honour of our teams. Okay. So moving on, we've got now the Temple of Hera. So Zeus was the king of the gods, Hera was the queen of the gods, wife to Zeus. Don't have a huge amount remaining for that temple. And again, this is what I was referring to earlier. So this is the modern lighting of the Olympic torch. But the idea of doing this with somebody quite often looking as though they're an ancient Greek is to make that connection between the original Olympic Games and the modern equivalents. And we can see here that transfer from ancient to modern. And today it's a real honour to be chosen as somebody who's going to carry that Olympic torch part of the way. Okay, we then have the track, and again you can see what there is left of that track. We can see the entrance to the track, so covered in sand. Okay, length is 192 meters, 600 Olympic feet. Now, why is it its length? There are 2 possibilities. So it could be that Heracles, who became a god, so Heracles the hero, the labours of Hercules, etc. It could be that he placed his feet one in front of the other 600 times. That's one of the origin myths. Or it was the distance that Heracles ran in one breath. Who knows? Did either of those happen? Probably not, but it's a nice story. Okay, I really rather like these. So these, the Zanes, the Zanes, we have along here. That's all of these statues in front of these temples. So these were in front of the treasuries. So these held the money that would be linked to the Olympic site, and they led to the stadium entrance. These were 6 bronze statues of Zeus, and these were funded from the fines of cheating competitors. I really rather like this, and I always think of this linked to parking fines. And I always think if we knew that the parking fines that we had to pay, or speeding fines that we had to pay, would go directly back to improving facilities within towns for roads, etc., I think people would accept those much better. So I do rather like the fact that these finds get ploughed right back into sort of beautifying the area. They showed Zeus about to hurl his thunderbolt, and of course the idea was that they were serving as a warning to competitors of the dangers of breaking the Olympic oath. And again, this is what we've got left here. Okay, so the competitors, really important to be aware, it was only men. So only men were allowed to compete from all over the Greek world. Women were not allowed to compete. Married women were not allowed to go to the games. We are not absolutely certain whether any women could go to the games. We think it's highly unlikely. A woman could own the chariots that took part in chariot races, but they could not race, so they could be involved in that regard as being an owner. So here we go, Pausanias again. On the road to Olympia, there is a precipitous mountain called Typeum. It is a law of Elis that any woman discovered at the Olympic Games will be pitched headlong from this mountain. So why no women? Well, fairly patriarchal society, so that's one thing. The expectation was that actually these athletes, most athletic competitions in ancient times were seen as preparation for warfare. And the reason that you had the competitions that they had and the types of races that they had were because they were all linked to aspects of warfare. And of course, you had predominantly men who would be the fighters, but also in the ancient Olympic Games, all the competitors competed naked. Okay, so changed a bit now since 1900, female competitors, as we know. So another writer, Epictetus, aren't you scorched by the fierce heat? He's describing what it was like being at the Olympic Games. Aren't you crushed in the crowd? Isn't it difficult to freshen yourself up? Doesn't the rain soak you to the skin? Aren't you bothered by the noise, the din, and other nuisances? But it seems to me that you are well able to bear, and indeed gladly endure all this when you think of the gripping spectacles that you will see. And I think that's why people go to live events today. Let's think of the football last night. You know, in the comfort of my sitting room, I'm sure I had an easier ride of it all, but I wasn't caught up in the atmosphere. And so that's why in ancient times, but also today, people go to these events. So the Olympic programme. So for the ancient Olympics, it was 5 days, just 5 days. There were lots and lots of religious activities. There were processions, there were sacrifices, there were oaths, there was prize giving. Obviously, there were sporting events, but there were also cultural events. So you had recitals. Remember, I talked about the Odeon, the theatre. You had tours of the area, etc. Whereas today, in the modern Olympics, it's about 3 times as long. And of course, you've got the opening and the closing ceremonies that were very much part of the modern Olympics. So let's have a look then at the events. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some images of a modern event versus an ancient event. Again, maybe somebody wants to identify any of these on the chat. That would be lovely. If not, it's absolutely fine. But I'm then going to talk about each of the ancient versions after I've run through the images. So, okay. So what have we got there? How would you describe that? Yeah. We go. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Not really that different, is it? Which is quite interesting. I mean, obviously the material is going to be different, but it's quite interesting looking at the way that the athlete's standing. What have we got here? Yeah. What would you consider to be a modern version of that? Because we don't have chariot racing in modern Olympics. Yeah. Or any other vehicles that we have in modern Olympics? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the velodrome, you know, I would say. I mean, it's only one person on one machine, but nonetheless, that's often what you had with the chariot, obviously. And we have horsepower, you know, human power here, perhaps rather than horsepower. Okay, and then, yeah, so we've got a running race, and you can see from the representation of those legs that they're running rather than walking. But yeah, absolutely. Okay, and we can see more there. Okay, and again, just to make the point, and there we go. Always good to see a bit of Usain Bolt, isn't it? Okay, now then, any ideas about what that might be?
Boxing, wrestling, type thing. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we're going to talk about that and say give you a little bit more information later on. So more wrestling and boxing here, as we can see. Okay, and again, more wrestling rather than boxing. We could talk about it in a bit. It's a pretty violent sport, this one. Okay, and again, here we go. We've got wrestling here. Something called pancration. What we've got here. So we did have the wrestling. What have we got? Yeah, absolutely. So you can see here we've got versions of gloves. Then they're not as padded as the modern ones, but you can see that they did have an element of that. And we'll talk about that in a bit. A lot more protection there. Okay. And then here we've got horse racing. As you said, we have equestrian events, don't we? Yeah, modern day Olympics. There we go.
High jump.
So yeah, high jump or certainly a jump, isn't it? That could be high jump or maybe a long jump. Yeah, yeah. So let's have, what do you think is going on here? Any idea what they may be? So you've got your hands there. These were weights. And they were actually to help propel you forward. And people have done reconstructions of this, and it does help. These weights, there we go. Okay, here we can see long jump there. Okay, we've got that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we had really sort of 4 types of events. You had your track event, so the races on those. You had the equestrian event, so the horse and the chariot racing. We had combat, so wrestling and something called pancration, which I'll talk about in a bit, and the boxing. And then we had the pentathlon, which we saw the elements of the running, the wrestling, the long jump, the discus, and the javelin. So the pente, the 5 different athletic events there. And we also had events for adults and boys aged between 12 and 18, so a slightly different category there. Okay, so these in a bit more detail are some of the things that we've either saw before or I talked a little bit about. So as I said, quite a lot of these events originated in martial preparation, wartime preparation. So we had this, which is a race in armour, known as the hoplita dromos. And so they would wear helmets, they would wear greaves, that's the leg armour, and they carried their shields, and these shields were kept in the Temple of Zeus. This reminds me a little bit of Miss Atkinson's office when she has asked her ancient historians to create shields, and yes, her office is covered in them. So that's our equivalent to the Temple of Zeus, our head of faculty there. And this was the last event of those 5 days. You can imagine, you know, how difficult that would have been. But again, think about, you know, when people are preparing, you know, they have exercise for the army, for example. It's very, very similar to this. As I say, that's what most of the athletic events were linked to. So the most dangerous event at the Games was the pancration. It was a type of wrestling where anything goes. Okay, so Philostratus talks about pancratiasts must employ backward falls which are not safe for the wrestler. They must have skill in various methods of strangling. They also wrestle with an opponent's ankle and twist his arm, besides hitting and jumping on him. But all these practices belong to the pancration, only biting and gouging being accepted. Well, thank goodness for that. I know, utterly ridiculous, but anyway. Okay, so we have the marathon. Now, marathon commemorates the run of Pheidippides. So he was a day runner, and he carried the news of the Persian landing marathon to Sparta. That was a distance of 147.2 miles in order to enlist help for the battle. Okay. Now, according to Herodotus, Pheidippides delivered the news to the Spartans the next day. He then ran back to Athens with the Spartans' reply, which was that due to observances, they could not leave Sparta until the full moon. The Thebans decided not to wait and attacked the Persians at Marathon. Pheidippides ran 25 miles back to Athens from Marathon to news of the Greek victory. So in less than 1 week, he ran 300 plus miles on a very rough terrain with hardly any rest. Upon his arrival to Athens, he declared Nike victory and died. So the trademark, so that the company Nike, as the kids call it, is deliberately taken from the ancient Greek goddess of victory, Nike, which a number of the students are very excited about when they know that name. So in terms of ancient prize winners, only the first place was awarded. That was the only one that you won, that you got anything for. And all they got was a wreath of olive leaves. But they'd get fame and glory, but no money, no other medals. But it was the winner of the sprint race who was named the Olympiad. So it was named after that individual. So again, going back to Usain Bolt, seemed to be, an elite athlete being able to have that speed. Okay. So think of the difference between the ancient Olympics and the lack of medals, and the Mo Farah, had to have Mo Farah in there. And these are the medals that are going to be used in the Paris Olympics this summer. And every Olympic Games, although you're going to have your gold, your silver, your bronze, every one is unique to the game. So you don't have similar emblems. They are always unique to the country and to the place. And there we have it. Okay. So, any questions either from yourself or anyone?
I was interested when you said that they competed naked. I've
Yes.
never thought of that.
Really? Okay.
No.
Yeah. Gymnastics actually means to compete naked, to exercise naked. Yes. Not that we do that today, but yeah, that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you.
That's all right. That's all right. So we finished a little bit early. I know I started a little bit late and finished a little bit early. I wasn't quite sure how long that was going to take. But I thought, in terms of how much information I give you, I thought this would be sufficient.
Okay.